Hey everybody, welcome to Truth Be Told. Thanks very much for being here and for listening in. I really appreciate your time. If you have listened to this project for any length of time at all, you probably know that one thing that I love to talk about, love to study, and love to share with you, especially because I just find it so interesting, is Old Testament examples, objects, events, or people that typify and foretell the events of Jesus Christ's life. This is the study of typology, and I just find it absolutely fascinating. And not only do I find it like academically, literarily very interesting, but it actually does affect my view of God and my connection with Him in a way, because for a moment, I am amazed at His ability to work His will and His plan in the lives of people in such a precise way without infringing upon their free will, without like puppeteering them and making them do certain things, but in the way that He has His authors write scripture and in the way that they remember events, the things that they choose to do as they follow after Him just begin to make this picture that once we see Jesus Christ, we're like, oh, that's what that was kind of pointing to. That event, that person, that object, that particular weird set of scripture where it's like, I don't know why that happened, or that seemed out of context, or that seemed out of place, or why are they mentioning this thing here? Suddenly, when Jesus comes along, you're like, oh, it was all to reflect this thing that was coming in a more perfect and more awesome way. And it just makes me feel like God is in control, and this is something I academically know, but when you see examples of it, like, wow, He did not just send Jesus Christ onto the world scene, and then they kind of had to pivot and play it by ear as people did this or that. They had to react to things. No, they were in control the whole time. Everything He did was just so precise and so predicted in the things that they worked out throughout the Old Testament. And I just think that's a beautiful thing. It really makes me feel amazed by God and also comfortable in the fact that He really is in control and that His will absolutely is going to be accomplished. And that's a nice thing to reflect on. So I share this a lot, or examples of this a lot, because that's how it affects me. And the whole point of this podcast, this YouTube channel, is to impress upon you how awesome the Bible is, because so often it can feel difficult to study. We can feel very distant from it. We can feel that it's very cold, very academic, and it can be academic. It can be difficult. I'm not saying it's not a labor to study the Word, but when we see some of these things in here and are kind of training our brains to start seeing them, like we're looking at the Bible through the lens of what was God doing in the Old Testament that pointed to the events of the New Testament, I think we begin to get an appreciation for God and for His Word and how the book is laid out, the authors, and I just think that is really cool. So that's why I share this stuff. And it's important too because it is truly all over the Old Testament. There's a section after the resurrection of Christ where Jesus is with His disciples, and it says He explained to them the scriptures concerning Himself. This is not a 10-minute conversation where He points back to one psalm and says, you know that one you guys like to sing? Yeah, that was about me. Or, you know that one little tiny section in Isaiah that was about the suffering servant? Like that was me. No, like everything is about Jesus. The entire Old Testament pointed to Him in one way or another, or called out for Him as a perfect fulfillment of things that happened as shadows in the Old Testament. And it's just a really, really cool thing. So if I could overhear one conversation, like, man, that would definitely be in the contention, because I just think that's such an amazing thing that Jesus sat down and personally was like, look at this, like, this story, you've heard this forever, you've sung this psalm, this prophecy, you've debated the meaning of it and what it would look like. This was all about me. Let me show you how. I just think that's an amazing thing, and it is everywhere. It's all throughout the Old Testament. But one place that I always struggle and always have a little bit of a difficult time seeing where this is true is in the book of Judges. Every time I read Judges and I think, okay, how is this about Jesus? How does this prefigure His life and the events in it? How does this point to Him or call out for Him as a greater answer of something better? I really struggle in the book of Judges. This book is largely historical. There's a pattern in it called the Judges cycle where Israel, God's people, consistently forgets him over time and turns to sin and then falls into difficulty, and then God brings them back. It's just this constant cycle of like kind of testing God's patience. And there's very few people in there that are like, okay, like this is really an admirable guy. Of course, you're going to go throughout all scripture, and even the greatest of people are going to have flaws, right? Like some of the heroes of our faith, Abraham, Moses, like you could list all of them, but just none of them are perfect. They all do things that are like, okay, that wasn't God's will. That wasn't very good. But in the Judges, it seems like everybody is just really falling short, and even the good guys, even the judges, who we assume are supposed to be the good guys anyways, they just end up being a product of their times. And it's like they might be slightly better than some, but they're not like hero material in many cases. And this isn't to say that types of Christ have to be perfect, right? Because all of them fall short in some way. And this is by design, because they're all supposed to cry out for that greater fulfillment that happens in the person of Jesus. So if you had, let's say you took Abraham, right, and said, okay, how does this guy and the events of his life and the things he does and says prefigure what Christ would do? How is he kind of walking in the footsteps of Christ that are yet to be walked? Is kind of a weird way to put it, but I think that makes sense of it a little bit. We're always going to find places where it's like, he didn't do it there. But always in those moments where these people fall short, that's where we see the way in which Christ fulfills it in an even better way. So for example, like Job is a really cool example, I believe, of like a type of Christ, because he is called righteous and yet he suffers. This sounds like Jesus, right? He is righteous and yet he suffers. We know that Job is not as righteous as Christ, but within the context of the story, he's presented to us as a righteous person who is suffering not because of obedience or disobedience, but because of the will of God to basically show his sovereignty in this plane of existence in the world, right? But we see Job also fall short in the story because he laments this perceived unfairness and he cries out for a mediator. But in this, we can see the more perfect fulfillment in Jesus, because Jesus goes like a lamb silent before its shearers and is killed without complaint, without lamenting the fact. He's just resolute in his purpose in this. And instead of crying out for a mediator or crying out at the injustice, he becomes the mediator between God and mankind. So it's a really cool thing. We see Job as this type, but in the place he falls short, it still points to Christ in a really cool way. We also have the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam's bride disobeys and sins, but instead of taking her punishment on himself, as Jesus Christ does for his bride, the church, Adam follows his bride into sin. So we see this need for a greater husband than Adam. We see this need for a second Adam in Adam's shortcoming. So yes, we can say that Adam and Christ are type and archetype of one another, but in the places that Adam falls short, we still see how that points to Christ. Abraham willingly offers Isaac, and Isaac appears to be willing in this sacrifice as well, but it's not supposed to be through Abraham and Isaac's obedience to sacrifice that God's greater plans are going to be accomplished. Instead, he says he will provide himself a lamb, and he will become that lamb. And so we see that Abraham and Isaac are a wonderful model of the Father and the Son entering into this sacrificial kind of dynamic. And we see Abraham and Isaac doing that same thing, but they're not the fulfillment of this thing. Still, we see God saying, I will yet provide myself a lamb for the sacrifice. And so in the inability of Abraham and Isaac to fulfill this, even though they were willing, like where Adam was not for Eve, even though they have this willingness, they are not able to take on that role like Christ is at a later date. But these examples, to me, feel so on the nose. I think we can't help but see the parallel if we're of a mind to see it. I think sometimes people have a difficulty with typology. They think, oh, you're kind of reaching a little bit, you're kind of stretching a little bit. But I think if you're thinking through the lens of storytelling and patterns, it becomes very easy to see. And once we realize that God did in fact have a plan all along, and we believe that he showed us that plan in pieces all along to show us, it's like if he never told us about it, then whenever he did, we'd be like, oh, okay, cool, that's what you're doing. But the fact that he showed us all along, and we can look back at it and say, man, like his plan was intended. All of this was supposed to happen exactly as it did. And he showed us this by showing us that plan ahead of time. I just think that's incredible. But once we're of this mindset, I really think we can't unsee it. But Judges is a totally different story for me. Judges feels messy. I've heard for a while now, for example, in the Judges, about a parallel between Jesus and Samson. And every time this has been presented to me in a church message or in some YouTube video or podcast or whatever, I always think, yeah, okay, I see it, but it doesn't feel as good to me as some of these other ones, like Abraham, Adam, Job. There's something about it that's off, and I haven't really been able to quantify it, but I think the theory that I'm going to present today, I think makes the most sense of it. But let's go through this. Samson's story has a lot of symbolism that kind of reminds us of the symbolism in Jesus' own story. Samson sacrifices his own life to deliver Israel. Obvious parallel there between what he does and what Jesus does. Samson has a bride that brings about his downfall. Well, Jesus' own people are the ones that sinned and made it necessary for him to come and take that penalty of sin. So we are, in a way, responsible for the death of Christ. There's a bit of an odd, weird section in the middle of Samson's story where honey, which is a symbol of like life and vitality, is found inside of a lion's carcass, which is a symbol of death, and with the obvious imagery of the Lion of Judah, referring to the Messiah. So we see these like imagery things and symbolic things and type things and the events that occur. But it's really odd to me because Samson is not just an imperfect example of this Jesus pattern. He is actually an antithesis of this pattern at times. And this is what bothers me. He is not sanctifying his bride like Christ is. He is unwisely chasing after a Philistine woman, contrary to what God commands Israel to do. So he's set up as a judge, but nearly everything he does is like impetuous and stubborn and unlawful. He is not valiantly going to his unjust death. Instead, Samson kind of stupidly ends up in the hands of his enemies over and over and over again. It's like, come on, man, like you gotta figure this stuff out. And then even in the example with a lion and the honey, even though we could see this as a very clear symbol of the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's an active breaking of his vow that was commanded by God at his birth that he would not touch a carcass of any dead thing, but he does it in order to eat this honey. And so it's like everything he does that kind of maybe looks like Jesus also looks like the opposite in a weird way, also is unlawful, also is sinful, also is poor character and poor judgment. And these things don't look like Jesus to me at all. So sometimes the moments where he is supposed to look most like Jesus, he looks the least like him. And that bothers me. But this pattern continues all throughout the Judges. Samson's actually not where I began to kind of study into this a little bit deeper. I was studying the story of Abimelech, who is the son of Gideon. And there, again, are some obvious things that look like Christ, but some obvious things that look like the exact opposite. For example, he is the son of a concubine, which is not a legitimate wife of Gideon. And so his birth origins are kind of fraught with maybe some kind of impurity, right? This was what Jesus was kind of accused of. His mother is a virgin, But then the common conception in the culture at the time was, well, maybe they were promiscuous, or maybe she slept with somebody else, or whatever. It's like Jesus' birth is like a little bit illegitimate in the eyes of his countrymen. But then going back into his lineage, he's got prostitutes and incestuous relationships and Gentiles coming into his birth line that are just like not clean, you know? And so we do see that, like that pattern between Abimelech and Jesus. Abimelech is also put off or rejected by his brothers, which we see happens to Jesus by his own countrymen. Abimelech makes himself the leader. Eventually there's this coup against him where the people rise up and kind of seek to overthrow him a little bit. But in order to put down that rebellion, he does this really interesting thing where he marches against this city. The townspeople are hiding in a tower, and it says he cut down wood and laid it across his shoulder. And then he tells his followers to go and do the same thing. He says they must also do as he has done. And I'm just like, man, that is very interesting. That sounds an awful lot like the cross, where we are supposed to take up our cross daily and follow after him. We kind of see this pattern in Abimelech's story. But then weirdly, he uses that wood to light a fire under the tower where all the townspeople are hiding. And then the people from above start throwing stuff down at Abimelech and his followers. And eventually he dies. It says because a certain woman throws a millstone down from the tower and it crushes his head. Now, again, some parts of this story seem very much patterned after Jesus' own story, but so many things feel the exact opposite way. Abimelech kills his brothers. He doesn't save them. The wood that Abimelech lays across his shoulders and asks his followers to lay across their own shoulders is used to kill the people that he should be protecting. Now, it's true he's carrying this wood to the site of his death, just like Jesus carried his cross to the site of his death. But the purpose of the wood that Abimelech is using it for is absolutely not what Jesus was carrying his own cross for. And then additionally, we have this idea in Genesis 3, there's a prophecy about Messiah where it says that he will bruise the head of the serpent, and the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. And so a mortal blow is dealt to the head of the serpent, but a bruising blow shall be dealt to the heel of the Messiah. Well, in this story of Abimelech, it's his head that is crushed. It's not his heel. He has a mortal wound inflicted upon him, and he dies from his head being crushed by this woman. So we have the woman motif, where it's like God's people often depicted as a woman, God's church depicted as a woman, being responsible for the death of the leader. That's us with Christ. But the crushing of the head is very much a symbol of the antithesis of Christ, the Satan. And this head crushing component actually reminded me of another story as I was studying the Judges, and that is the story of Sisera. This one's really interesting because Sisera is not even a judge of Israel. He is actively an enemy of God's people, and yet I see some parallels to Jesus' story that seem kind of obvious to me. In the story of Sisera, he descends from his chariot, this place of power, and he finds this woman that he believes he can trust, but he's ultimately betrayed by that woman. Again, we see that same motif where the woman kills the person who has descended or who has come to them, right? Like you approach the woman kills you. That's kind of what happens in the Jesus story as well a little bit. But then Sisera is also stabbed in the head with a tent peg. So it's not that heel blow that happens, it's the death blow to the head, like we see with David and Goliath, where Goliath absolutely represents that seed of the serpent. So is Sisera kind of in the place of Jesus, where he sought refuge with people he should have trusted or could have trusted or believed were trustworthy, but instead they end up betraying him and killing him? Or is Sisera kind of in the place of the serpent from the Genesis 3 prophecy? I see evidence of both. But as I've been thinking about this the past few days, I have this theory that I think might make sense of many of the examples and stories from Judges, not just the ones we've looked at. And the answer is both are true. And maybe this shouldn't surprise us as much as it does. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, Paul writes something that may hold a clue. He says, "For our sake, he made him to be sin," him referring to Jesus Christ, "to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." So at the cross, we have both sin and righteousness on full display. You have sin at full strength as it murders the Lamb of God, but you also have the love of God at full strength as it takes on that punishment for us. You have Jesus, who is God in the flesh, fulfilling the greatest part of God's plan, looking a lot like Satan winning. You have innocent, perfect Jesus taking on the disgusting and staining sin of the world. It wasn't just Jesus on the cross. We have to remember that. It was also the sin that he carried on it as well. In this way, the cross is the blow to the serpent's head. It is the place of Satan's defeat, but it is also the bruising of Messiah's heel at the exact same time. So we should expect to see both. So it's possible that in the book of Judges, where we see all these figures stepping into roles of judge or deliverer, or even as tools for God's judgment, in Sisera's case, we might be seeing patterns of what Jesus did for us on the cross, which has both elements, which has both God there and sin there. So it's important to remember that the cross is like the biggest battle between God and sin. Both are going to be present. It is where God is victorious over sin, but we shouldn't necessarily be surprised when in the, I guess I'll call it a pre-telling of this story, we see evidence of sin in that story as well. When we read the stories found in the book of Judges, it can feel a little bit messier than it should if we're expecting to only see a reflection of Jesus there. But just as Jesus Christ in himself was perfect, but took on imperfect sin at the same time in order to destroy it on the cross, individuals in the book of Judges may represent Christ in really fascinating and compelling ways, while also embodying the very thing that Jesus Christ defeated at the cross. And I think this view makes the stories in Judges that look a little bit messy actually become more perfect patterns of what Jesus Christ accomplished at the cross.